It's a pathological attempt of a society with a huge inferiority complex to try to catch up to the West. Well, she's been standing there since 1931, and for 39 years, it was the tallest building in the world. The Empire State Building is America's iconic skyscraper. There are other buildings that got taller in the United States, including the World Trade Center, which is no longer with us. But nothing is like the World Trade Center. It's made out of granite. It took a hit from an airplane back around World War II. A B-25 flew right into it. It was finished, as I said, in 1931. It's never caught fire. It's never shaken. It's never done any of those things because it's built to last, and it's an amazing piece of architecture and one of the modern wonders of the modern world. Now, we've all seen how cities in China look like they're out of some kind of science fiction rendering, but there's a little bit more to the story than that. Here, for example, is footage of a Chinese skyscraper. It's 1,000 feet tall. The Empire State Building tops out at 1,400 feet. It's called the SEG Plaza. It's 1,000 feet tall. And as you can see from the inside, there was a day not too long ago when everything in the building started shaking. So the occupants of the building immediately ran out into the street, quite convinced that this was an earthquake. And I've been through several earthquakes look exactly like this. They found to their surprise when they got on the street that the street was doing fine, but the building was still shaking. Apparently it shook for 3 days. There was no earthquake. This gigantic 1,000-foot skyscraper was simply wobbling and doing that, and it wasn't even windy out. I've also seen a movie from back in the day called The Towering Inferno, where a skyscraper caught fire about halfway up, and the fire consumed, a number of floors. And of course, once again, we saw 9/11 fires in skyscrapers, but I've never seen anything like this before. This is a 40-story building also in China that developed a fire, was completed in 2000, and the fire consumed the entire building. I've never seen anything like this before, ever. Not too long ago, I did a video called Chinese Ghost Cities, where I talked about how all of the capital in China that's owned by the Chinese workers has nowhere to go except in building construction projects, and many of those were not finished. And now looking at these two examples, guys, I'm beginning to think it's actually probably kind of a blessing for them that they're just concrete skeletal structures, because when they put materials in them, they catch fire. This building burned as badly as it did because it was built out of flammable materials. There were no sprinkler systems that we're aware of. The electronics, the electrical wiring was shoddy, and all the rest. This might be a good time to introduce Steve Green and Scott Ott, by the way. Gentlemen, this is known as tofu drag. It's the building code in China, and when they referenced the shaking skyscraper that we just showed you, the Chinese themselves are saying that building is made out of Chinesium, and that's why it's about to fall down. I'll put a couple of other highlights here together, just some video of tofu drag, this monumentally substandard construction standards in China. So, guys, here's the reason why I keep wanting to bring this back. We are told by our betters in the university circuit and among certain political parties that this authoritarian one-state rule is really the answer, and that China is an example that we should all be looking up to. This is what Chinese architecture looks like, and it's not just one or two cases. The entire city is essentially, the entire country is largely made out of Chinesium. Steve, we're all solid conservatives here, and we know that the government is usually not our friends, but living here, especially in earthquake-prone California, I do believe that there are some legitimate roles for the government, and one of them is inspecting buildings. In China, the large construction companies are also largely owned by the Chinese Communist Party. So the financial reason to cut corners is there, and what would normally be the counterweight in terms of government oversight, in terms of inspections, is also on the side of cutting the corners to make some more profit. It doesn't sound like a recipe for long-term success to me.
Yeah, government is a lousy watchdog for government. The incentive is just not there in that case. As what do they call them in China? Is the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises that conduct a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. The SOEs were really getting trashed during the serious reform years in the 90s and the early noughts, because China was actually moving in a free market direction, and the SOEs were becoming a smaller and smaller part of the economy. Well, that has changed in recent years, and the reason is it starts at the top with Xi Jinping. He He loves himself some communism, and the results are right there on fire. I used to go to ball games at Candlestick Park. That building is the real deal. Yikes, I've never seen anything like that. It's frightening as hell. Years ago, Ace of Spades, he was talking about construction projects in the Arab world, the oil-rich Arab world, where we haven't seen any of this kind of stuff. Thank goodness. But he came up with what he called the Dirk Diggler effect. And this is just such a perfect analogy. Boogie Nights, the P.T. Anderson movie, is one of my favorites. Came out in 96, 97. It's set in the San Fernando Valley porn world of the 1970s and early 80s. And it's just some wonderful over-the-top melodrama comedy, just great flick. Anyway, our hero is a young porn star named Dirk Diggler. That's his screen name. He basically only has one talent. You can probably guess what that is. And as the money starts coming in, he blows it on, the most expensive Corvette and a lot of cocaine. And by the end of the movie, near the end of the movie, I should say, in the third act, that beautiful Corvette, well, he and his buddy are pushing this kind of wreck of a Corvette to try and get it to, they're trying to push start this thing because he's Dirk Diggler. He doesn't know how to take care of anything. He knows how to spend the money to get the nice thing, but he doesn't know or care to maintain it. So the beautiful car is now a wreck that he has to push start. And that's kind of what we're seeing in China. I should say in mainland China, this idea that they could have built everything great. They knew how to do it. They built the country from scratch in the last 25 years. So I said on the backstage show, if it's not an artifact like the Forbidden City, there's nothing in China more than 25 years old. I exaggerate, but not by much. And they could have built world-class cities, earthquake-proof, fire-proof, everything. They didn't because they're communists and the incentives aren't there. And before I finish, I just want to say one thing. This isn't a Chinese thing. This is a communist thing. I would not hesitate to step into a skyscraper in the Republic of China on Taiwan. I wouldn't hesitate to step into a skyscraper in Chinese Hong Kong. Communist China? Ooh, no. I'll stay on the ground floor, if that.
Funny brand of communism, isn't it, where the Communist Party is involved in these multi-billion-dollar industries of construction and are there to bilk the Chinese people of whatever hard-earned savings they have. Yeah. You make a great point about Taiwan, Stephen. There's another point that needs to be made, too. I find myself guilty of this because I find the actions of China to be reprehensible. They're not our friends. They are definitely our cultural enemies, and they're spending a lot of money doing their very best to destroy this country. And my wife has taught me to continually remind myself that it's not the Chinese people who are doing this, it's the Chinese government. Yes. That's a distinction that needs to be made. And Scott, the reason that this is, it's a morally important distinction to make at any time, but clearly the people who watch China, and I don't mean watch what the Chinese government do, the people who listen to the people on the streets of China are noticing that there is a rapidly growing backlash to this. They are refusing to pay these mortgages that they got into to pay for buildings that will never be finished. The people that ran out of that shaking skyscraper that was not undergoing an earthquake were not happy campers and not happy about getting back into that building again anytime soon either. And so you have to ask yourself, how long can this go on? If the building, a 1,000-foot skyscraper is a significant, that's a huge thing. The top floor of the Empire State Building office is only 1,200 feet. It's an enormous building. If this building is about to collapse without any wind or any vibrations, you have to ask yourself, what is going to happen when a serious earthquake does strike and millions of people find themselves inside these buildings that are made out of sand and rebar that you can just snap like this? I suspect that it's going to take a catastrophe of that scale for the Chinese people to overcome their history of just brutal authoritarianism and repression. But they're getting angry. And if the Chinese people are getting angry at what the Chinese government is allowing, then there's some signs that the Chinese government may not be around forever, and that would be good for the whole world as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and imagine the kind of repair and restoration project that ensues after that. I mean, if the communist government should fall, they've got to go back through and basically say, okay, we can't trust any of this stuff. And the investment there is going to be immense just to try to make safe buildings that were built in a slipshod manner. You know, it's not like no buildings ever catch fire or collapse in the United States, but when they do, it's a freak story. Like when you were talking about that, I thought, okay, that building collapsed in Miami, largely because the guidelines from the government, which is in charge of monitoring those, were ignored. Oh yeah, that balcony collapsed and killed a couple of hundred people, or 114 people, and 200 some were injured in Kansas City. And I had to look it up on my phone. I'm like, when was that? Oh, that was 1981.
Oh, wow.
Like, as I'm going back and trying to think of what is like this? And there's just not a whole lot like this. And our news media is all over anything. You know, if it bleeds, it leads, and fires are number one on the news. Imagine what it's like in China when we're just getting sort of, in many cases, kind of surreptitious videos sneaking out of the country, or situations where it's so big, you've got a 656-foot tall candlestick in the middle of your city and there's no way to hide it. But imagine the things that we don't know about that are going on there. All of this reminds me of an encounter that I had with a Chinese student. Our church in Pennsylvania had a dinner every year at Thanksgiving for students who couldn't go home to their families for Thanksgiving, and they were primarily international students. And so they were from other countries, and they were attending local colleges and universities throughout the Lehigh Valley. And I was talking to this young Chinese man, and I said, where do you go to school? And he said, Lehigh University. And I said, why do you go there? And he starts telling me about this amazing professor of engineering that had a worldwide reputation, and that he specifically wanted to go so he could study under this professor of engineering. And I said, well, in a country the size of China, certainly you have many great professors of engineering and many great engineering schools. Why would you want to travel, leave your family, travel halfway around the world, all just to come here to the United States to study at Lehigh under this professor? And he looked at me like I was out of my mind. Like, what's wrong with you? Why would you even ask a question like that? Of course I want to be at Lehigh rather than any university in China. Of course I'd rather study under this man rather than the best in China, because I want to be an engineer and I want to be good. And that disconnect where, like, I'm sure he loves his family, he loves his country, he loves his city, but he knew that ultimately, if he wanted to be an engineer, he better get out of there and come here and learn how to do it right.
Do it right. It is not a racial thing. It's not a location thing. It is a cultural thing. It's, Scott pointed out, we have had buildings collapse. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite channels on YouTube is called Fascinating Horror, that looks at a series of engineering catastrophes in the most level-headed, even-toned manner. And time again, you find cases where somebody's cut corners or somebody locked a fire exit with a chain because they were about shoplifting or whatever. And again and again and again. But the one lesson that you take from these catastrophes in the West is that virtually every one of these cases results in changes to building codes, changes to legislation. I'm much more familiar with the aviation aspect of that, where we say that that aviation regulations are written in blood. And what that means is we don't know what we don't know until we know it. But when we know it, it's the nature of our culture to do what is ever necessary to find out what the actual cause is, not cover it up because of political reasons or embarrassments, and find out what went wrong so that we fix it so that it never has to happen again. So I don't have any problem with government inspectors. The most horrific plane crash that I'm aware of was the Alaska Airlines airplane that went in just off the coast of California, not far from where I live, where the plane had a trim down situation and the crew fought it for half an hour. They flew the plane inverted for 5 minutes trying to save that plane, but they couldn't do it. Finally went into the water, killed everybody. Turned out that there was a jack screw that controls the pitch on the elevator, and it had been improperly lubricated because they were cutting costs on maintenance. And so all of those innocent lives and all of that heroism because somebody was trying to save a little bit of money. That kind of thing, inspecting that kind of thing, is what a not this government, a government is for. That's what a government is for. My problem is when the government starts saying you can't build this here, you can't build this there, you can't cut down the tree in your own backyard. That's my problem. Don't tell me what I can do, but yes, it's good to have a third party check all these things out. China is in many ways watching. It's like watching the Soviet Union at 20 times the speed. It's a pathological attempt of a society with a huge inferiority complex to try to catch up to the West and doing whatever's ever necessary to get the illusion of that. But it's not sustainable. It's not possible without the substrata, without the culture of responsibility. Our buildings don't fall down. And on the rare occasions where they do, it's a national catastrophe. It's a national story. And most importantly, we find out why it fell down so that it doesn't happen again. That's not happening in China. But here's the kicker, folks. That culture of that engineering excellence, that culture of safety, that culture of responsibility is bred by American culture. American culture used to consist of the most highly educated people in the world, people who went to the moon on the math in their heads. Now, China is turning out hundreds of millions of top quality engineers with spectacularly excellent educations, with a lot of focus there. And in the United States, you find out that you do these on the street interviews and these people can't tell you who fought in the Mexican-American War. It's almost like the old Grant's tomb joke, who's buried in Grant's tomb. They couldn't tell you. The culture, I don't know what's happened to my focus here, but in any event, the culture is something that extends over time. And if we are now raising generations of people who cannot tell time on a digital clock, who don't know what year the United States got its independence, if that is the output of our educational system, if you think that kind of a result is going to be able to continue this kind of a record of excellence, you're out of your minds. Our biggest problem is not the frailty or the flaws in our buildings. They were built by giants. Our problem is that the engineers and the builders of tomorrow are coming out of colleges not knowing how to add, let alone calculate loads on buildings. And if that doesn't scare you, then nothing will. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time right here on Right Angle.